everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, Pat and I are going to be talking about game modes. We talked in a previous episode about how a good way to stave off airsoft burnout or fatigue is to change up the game modes that you play. If you only ever play team deathmatch games, it can get stale pretty quickly. And there's a lot more out there than just deathmatch, air control, capture the flag game modes. In fact, there's almost an unlimited number of ways that you can play a game of airsoft. Some good, some bad. So what we're going to talk about today is really what kind of games have we enjoyed in the past, what were some that didn't live up to our expectations, and fundamentally, what really goes into making airsoft game modes fun and playable versus maybe frustrating and perhaps even not fun at all.
We're sort of going to try the good, the bad, and the ugly of airsoft game modes, at least according to us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think where I wanted to start with this is by going over quickly what a typical day of airsoft looks like for us, which we've kind of done a bit in the past and glossed over, but I wanted to go into a bit more detail. So usually when we play a skirmish on the weekend, we end up playing about a dozen games or so.
Give or take, yeah. Sometimes it's a few more, sometimes it's a few less, but it doesn't work out.
And I mean, sometimes we decide that a game mode that we usually run for 30 minutes, we all going to run for 15 or vice versa. But so generally speaking, it follows a typical framework. So number one, we start off with a few team deathmatches to just get warmed up, right? Just a couple of really quick games to get running around the field, no respawns, just get out there, run as fast as you can, get the blood pumping and so on. And once we've done a couple of those, then we'll progress to a variety of other types of deathmatches with objectives or just straight up objective-based games. And another thing that we sometimes consider is some of our games have respawns, some of them don't, some of them have unlimited respawns. And it's more about the clock rather than just, sort of a war of attrition. So, for example, one of the game modes that we play, you could call basically King of the Hill, where there's a flag at the middle of the field and you need to be the team controlling that flag at the end of, 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Sometimes teams have unlimited respawns to do that for the whole 20 minutes. Sometimes you have 2 or 3 respawns. We might do a similar thing with an attack and defense style game, where one team needs to prevent the others from getting into a certain building or area or to get a prop into a certain places. And in some cases, the defenders might have more respawns than the attackers or vice versa. They might have bigger numbers. They might have unlimited respawns. And it's all just about getting that done in a certain time constraint, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or whatever. And changing the types of respawns and stuff that you have, the timers, is a really good way of just changing the way that the game is played, because I'll guarantee you, if you only give me 10 minutes to do something, it's going to look a lot different than if you give me half an hour to achieve the same thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you're giving us 10 minutes and unlimited respawns, we're going to be a lot sloppier than 30 minutes and 2, right?
Yeah, we're going to be running up and doing all kinds of foolish things, right?
Yeah. And in fairness, there's a lot of fun for us in both of those game modes, right? Because sometimes doing a ton of dumb stuff in an effort to win quickly is a laugh, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally we'll do that for a bit. Later in the day, we might do something a bit more lighthearted. One of the game modes that's really popular right now is called Assimilation. It's sometimes also called Zombies, but essentially a very small group of players start attacking the other team. They have unlimited respawns, but every time they hit an opposing player, that player switches to the assimilating team. And then the game ends after a certain amount of time, or if all the other team is actually assimilated. And it's a good way to burn through ammo and stuff like that throughout, at the end of the day or whatever, but it's not always clear cut. Right, we played one last weekend, and the assimilators actually didn't win. They didn't manage to assimilate everyone in the time limit, right? So it's a pretty fun and lighthearted game that we try and play at some point because, like I said, it's popular.
And it's, as Phil said, it's a good way to burn through some ammo. It's a good way to sort of get everyone to mix together and work with some people who, you don't necessarily play with as much, which can be really good. It's a good community sort of game mode. I will note, because we have tried this, it does not work so well if you decide that the zombies shouldn't have guns.
Yeah.
That got tried here a couple of times. It was a terrible idea. Don't do it.
Yeah, or only headshots count, which is just, yeah, bad times.
Yeah, being shot in the face gets old startlingly quickly, as it turns
Yeah,
out.
totally. And as I think about that game mode in particular too, one of the things that I appreciate is the shift in mindset that happens. So if you're on the defending team, let's say you're not on the assimilators, you only have one life on that team. So when you're not actually hit yet, your fundamentals, at least for me, I'm really concerned about my fundamentals. I want to make sure everything is nice and tight and that, I'm cornering really well. I'm manipulating my rifle really well because I don't want to get hit. I want to stay in the game as long as possible. So you're being
absolutely.
very cautious and not sloppy and very, at least for me, very focused on doing it as well as you can. But then when you get hit, you have unlimited lives. So you go from like being nice and tight to like completely loosey-goosey when you get to the other side. We're just like running and screaming and doing whatever, right? Because none of it matters. You have unlimited lives. You have to get the job done as quickly as possible.
And in a lot of ways, it highlights that sort of difference between the 10-minute game mode and the 30-minute game mode, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No question there. Another game mode that we actually kind of take for granted sometimes, but we have a map at the frontline field, which is actually a D-Day style map. So it's a big, flat, open piece of terrain that has trenches dug in, that has like tank traps and bunkers and stuff like that. And then it's got bunkers elevated on one end. And so it's like this sort of D-Day landing, right? You basically have to cross, the attacking team, I should say, has to cross all this open ground and manage to get their way all the way to the bunkers. So, I mean, you can imagine what that's like. I'm sure we've all seen like Saving Private Ryan. Like it's a bit of a like a frag fest in that respect because you have a lot of guns shooting at people who are largely exposed.
It is an exercise in what I wouldn't give for artillery.
Yeah. But on the flip side, when you're an attacker, you tend to have a lot more guys. And then when you're a defender, you have, limited respawns and all this kind of stuff. So, but it's a really fun game mode. And I think we take it a bit for granted, but there's lots of fields, around the world that don't have that sort of setup where they have like an open field with rows of trenches and bridges and stuff that go over. So, I mean, it's a pretty fun map though. I mean, it does get a bit exhausting after a while, like especially if you're the one running, like
yeah, it's
after
a very
a while
physically
you get tired.
intense. It's a very physically intense game.
Yeah.
So it's not like the best game mode to repeat. Bang, 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 bang. We're just going to do this over and over again. But it's always fun to play, right?
Yeah.
And it's always sort of satisfying to accomplish either half of.
Yeah.
Because the bunkers they're not what I'd call the best defensive structures you're ever going to see.
Yeah.
And so defending them actually does take some more work than you might expect.
Yeah, and good personal skills because like there's lots of openings and stuff like you got to be conscious of. It's pretty easy to sneak a BB in through there if you're what where you're looking to aim and stuff. So it's you're absolutely right. It takes a little bit of work. A couple of things that we've also recently taken to doing, a couple of game modes that we've looked at, we've lifted just straight from video games. So one of them is called Rush and the other one is Payload. And they also provide a bit of a nice change of pace. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. But so basically Rush is you have one attacking team and one defending team. And the attacking team needs to push down the field trying to capture sequential objectives. And as they do that, their respawn line moves forward, and then the defensive line moves backwards until they're eventually pushed off of the quote-unquote map, and then the game is over. In Payload, one team has to try to bring the payload. So in our case, it's actually a ref who sits in a bit of a protective, or stands, I should say, in a bit of a protective enclosure. And then we need to move the payload from one end of the field to the other. And the payload, or the ref, moves under his own power, but only while one team is in immediate contact with it, basically like pushing it as though it were a heavy object down the field. And then so you win when the payload goes from point A to point B. So these are lots of different ways that we've, tried to change the types of games that we play, utilize our fields a little bit differently, and just sort of keep it fresh.
And I mean, we've lifted them from video games because they're as refreshing in Airsoft as they were when they were introduced in video games, right? Like, as it turns out, there is only so much Unreal Tournament you can play.
Yeah. And to be fair, like there are some game modes that you do see in video games that really don't work that well in Airsoft, and we'll talk about that a little bit later for sure. One of the things, though, is when you look at these games, like there's many different variations, right? There's as many variations really as you can come up with. Like we were saying before, if you were playing a game with no respawns versus the exact same game mode with unlimited respawns, the way that feels and the way that plays is going to be very different,
Yeah,
right?
drastically.
Yeah. And so that's sort of where, I want to sort of branch off our discussion. So you guys have a good sense of the types of games that we play sort of on the regular, let's call it. But I want to take a bit of time to go through some of our old favorites, so to speak. So Pat, from your perspective, what is one of your favorite game types that we've played?
So I'm going to preface this by noting that like a lot of my favorite game modes require a player who is willing to be chill and sit out for a game, or require like organizers. I don't think it's a drawback, but it's a thing to be aware of. So probably my favorite game mode, or one of my favorites, is sort of, the old hostage rescue, right? Like just, have a player who's willing to sit out, who's technically on the team of the rescuing side, and have them have to go and collect him and get him to an extraction zone, usually with limited respawns or no respawns for the attackers and some respawns for the defenders.
Yeah, so that's more of like a milsim type
Yeah,
game mode,
definitely. And it ends up being, basically get to point A, retrieve hostage from point A, get to point B, which is not necessarily a complicated game mode. But like I enjoy playing it as the hostage because it's usually a laugh. Like it's usually interesting to see how people try to get me from point A to point B. I really enjoy playing it as the defender, because usually it's that sort of like, a bunch of us versus a smaller team of guys who are either pretending they're elite players or acting as elite players, or sometimes versus a smaller team of us defending, depending on how we're trying to do stuff. But yeah, and watching guys try to shield me with their bodies when they're trying to get me out as a hostage is hilarious because I'm a huge ogre of a human. Meanwhile, like tucking people behind me when I'm rescuing is also extremely satisfying because again, you're not going to shoot Phil if he's behind me.
That's true. That's why you're on the team in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. I'm mobile cover. It's great.
But it's interesting that you bring that up though, because like I think we've played that particular game mode dressed up in a variety of different ways, whether it was hostage rescue or VIP extraction or down pilot extraction or anything like that you can imagine, like Black Hawk Down scenario, whatever. It's all like a similar sort of vibe, right? Where like you're saying you got one smaller team, typically smaller, trying to pry a one particular resource or individual or whatever out of the hands of a larger defending force, right?
And you can make it as big or as small as you want, right? Like you can run this in, a small area with 4 players, right? You can run it in a huge area and add additional objectives that aren't just the hostage, right? If you're getting bored with it, you can go, maybe the hostage, has actually sided with his captors today, and if we give him a gun, he's going to shoot us. Maybe we say, no, like you're absolutely sure you can give him a gun. So the hostage ends up getting some play towards the end of the game with like a pistol or whatever other spear gear the rescuing team has been willing to hump along to try to arm him.
Or maybe the hostage has broken legs and you have to fire him and carry them, depending on what, the state of the hostage. So, I mean, if they were you, I don't think that would be very feasible because like, I don't know many people strong enough to carry you on their back. But if it was like your sister who weighs like 90 pounds soaking wet, then different story, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it ends up being a fairly versatile game mode.
One of the biggest challenges that I've seen or that I recall from those game modes is always that the hostage just ends up getting shot, right? Which, if you think about like hostage rescue movies and stuff like that, that like very rarely happens as part, as part of the plot device. Like the whole idea is they're not going to get shot because otherwise the story is just over. Now in real life, obviously that can happen. But like for airsoft purposes, like I remember a couple of times just like doing a hostage game and then getting to the hostage or shooting the hostage myself. And then we're just sort of sitting around like, okay, well, what happens now?
Yeah, it's like, that wasn't supposed to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, I mean, as much as I would say leaving that in can be a good sort of funny moment in airsoft where you're like, oh, oops. I would also probably be willing to say that like avoiding that, figuring out some rules to like accommodate it happening, or avoiding it by better play. Because I mean, we've definitely had that happen and then gone, perhaps next time we will take a more circuitous route rather than going straight through the remainder of the enemy team.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think that's something that you really need to consider, and especially when you think about it from a game design standpoint, but also the fact that many, I would say most airsofters are not sort of in the military and consequently aren't used to thinking about their objectives in terms of risk in that respect, right? So if you're like, okay, well, we just need to get to the extraction zone, let's get there as quickly as possible. Whereas someone who's accustomed to coming up with like missions and op orders and stuff would go, okay, we need to find the best extraction route and we need to have that planned ahead of time because XYZ, I mean, you can't afford to have the person shot.
Yep. And it ends up being good for those players who like to be, because we all know players who like to be sneaky, right? That group of players who are like, yeah, I want to play sort of stealth and try to avoid getting shot at and be, kind of, a ninja. This is a game mode that if you're doing the extraction thing and it's, over any sort of significant distance or significant area, yeah, it can absolutely be a really good game mode to get those players involved.
Yeah, and it's the cool part about that game, and I think you sort of nailed it at the beginning when you're saying like, it can be as big or as small as you really want it to be. So you can decide that you're going to have like a 20-minute objective game, right? And it's just going to be sort of low key, get it done as quick as possible, low number of players, or you can sort of, to use a cooking term, sort of zhuzh it up a little bit and make it like an hour-long game and add complexity and stuff like that. And again, when we talk about game design a bit later, one of the things you want to avoid is just throwing in complexity just for complexity's sake. If there's going to be complexity, it needs to add to the gameplay. It needs to be fun complexity.
And it needs to be comprehensible.
Yeah, totally. But we'll talk about that in a little while. I think for me, one of the things that I find enjoyable in general is just larger sort of strategic plans, right? And I've designed a number of scenarios using the system that I think would be the most fun to play, but I've never actually got to play it. But it's this idea of holding the different like capture points on the map, and then you get points whenever you're able to report to your command structure that you actually control them. So what I've done in many of the milsims that I've run, or milsim adjacent games that I've run, is that your game controller, which is like your command chain or whatever, your generals back at base or whatever you want to call it.
Whoever you're reporting to.
Yeah, exactly. Call you as the commander and say, hey, I want a sit rep from you. What objectives do you control? And then if you as a commander can confirm I control X, Y, Z objectives, and the referees are able to verify that, then you get that many points for that particular call-in, right?
Yep.
And so why I think that that's fun is that it's pretty straightforward, but it adds a very significant level of complexity in terms of your span of control as a leader, right? Because you need to have faith in the people you have in the field to report accurate information to you about your current situation, right? So you need to be in touch with your people on the field to say, what do we currently control? What does the sort of map look like as it stands? And in so doing, you have a better idea of sort of the overall state of the battlefield and where you then need to control or allocate forces or whatever in order to be able to shape it and, maintain whatever presence you want on the field. And I like that complexity because it's just complicated enough that it adds a layer sort of gameplay, but not overly complicated in that, we're getting commanders to send like, all these like line reports and stuff like that. It's just a very simple process.
Yep. One thing I think I should note there is that we found when we're running that particular game mode that it's often good to design your field and design your scenarios, but then to add additional stuff in to create conflict.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because if there are 5 capture zones, the teams won't necessarily work as hard to grab all 5 of them, or to grab 3 of the 5 as you'd think they might for any given period of time. Like there'll be sort of intensity of play near the pre-planned, HQ is going to call points. But, it's good to have like missions that are like, go patrol this grid reference on our map. Mm-hmm. Go here and check for enemy hostiles just to push parts of both teams into going to the same area of the map to engage in conflict, because that's sort of why we're here. And especially that's important if you're using, as we have in a couple of cases, a fairly big area in terms of just like square kilometers for the game.
Yeah, and I mean, we can sort of talk a little bit about sort of the game design. Or we said we were going to do it later. I mean, there's no reason why we can't just sort of talk a little bit about it now. I think while you're looking at these like game modes and stuff and planning, you're absolutely right to say that part of it is pre-planning some conflict because, well, it's not that airsoft teams and like, if you give a commander, the commander is not going to want to go beat the enemy team, but you're not going to necessarily seek out conflict if you're in a position where there's 5 capture points and you control 3 of them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you control 3 objectives. You know that if the day just continues exactly like that, you're going to win. You don't necessarily feel the need to expose yourself to go and do more. And so in those situations, I've always had missions that I would give the commanders, and I would say, hey, command needs you to do this. And in some cases, it would on purpose weaken certain parts of their line potentially so that the other team could exploit it. But the other team didn't necessarily know. So it would not be a situation where I would say team A has to move their defenders away from this position and then give the other team the mission to go attack them. But rather to say, hey, so command is asking you to go from here to there. If the other team is watching you and they're paying attention, they will see your forces diverted and they should think, hey, we have an opportunity here, we could push.
So it rewards people for recon, right? It rewards people for actually, looking around and paying attention.
And communicating too, because it's not just a matter of seeing it, but you need to understand what you just saw and then pass it on so that you can say, oh, hang on, 10 of the guys who were here a few minutes ago defending it just left. We need to go.
And it is worth noting that like this is a much harder game mode to play without radios, or with like a large percentage of your team not having radios. If everyone has comms, then it ends up being much easier to coordinate groups of people. Surprise. But as common sense as that feels, it hasn't always been when we've played it. We've run it and played it and had expectations other than, oh man, like we have 10 radios for 30 guys. That should be completely fine. And I mean, we've played it with like, 3 radios for 30 guys, and that is much worse.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things as well is as a commander, like you rely on your team's radios, and when they stop working mid-game, and that's happened almost every single game that I've played, we have communication failures with certain parts of certain teams. That's a big challenge. So you always want to make sure you're all set. But that being said,
how do we
that
uncomplicate
game,
this?
well, yeah, that's just real life complicating things in addition to the pre-planned stuff. But yeah, that being said, like that's a game mode that I thought is really effective, right? It's this idea of like area control with points when you call in your sit rep or whatever, and you can make them random times or you set times, whatever. But then on top of that, you layer on additional missions that force the teams to do other stuff. And some of the things that we found worked really well. One in particular that I really enjoyed running, and I think if I had been playing it, I thought that would have been really dope, was a mission where we got one of the teams to go and observe recon only, do not engage under any circumstance, and observe one particular point on the map, which was highly visible. And one of the referees was holding up a yellow placard. And on the placard were a letter and a number. And the recon team had to look at the placard. They had to recon back to command what that code was, what the letter and what the number was, and then command had to report it to their commander had to report it to their command structure. And if they got the letter and the number correctly and their team was not seen, then they would get full points. And on purpose, I selected numbers and letters that were hard to understand over the radio unless you were using a phonetic alphabet of some sort. So I think that if I remember correctly, my one of the signs said like T, like Tango 9, right? And so if you're on the radio and it's garbled and you're whispering because you don't want the other enemy team to hear you, and you say, T9, and he goes, "Did you say P5?" It's like, no, it's like T, like 10. And just basically increasing that stress, but also in a very simple way. Like, it didn't have to be like a 15-line code or anything like that. It was big enough that if you had any sort of magnified optic, you would have no trouble seeing it clearly. Even without a magnified optic, you could probably pick it out unless your eyesight was really bad, in which case, why did they pick you for the recon team? But that's a different story. But yeah, so that's like a quick little mission that the team could do. The commander had to balance who they were going to send versus, the effectiveness of those players and perhaps the location that they were in. And just throwing in stuff like that throughout the games is just a way to sort of spice things up.
I will say people definitely had an interesting time doing that as well. It was almost comically frustrating for some of the people trying to actually get that recon information from their recon teams. Just because you wouldn't expect going to a place and reading a little card and radioing it back to be challenging, but it can be.
And I think this is a good place to talk about like where complexity doesn't necessarily make gameplay more fun. So when we thought about what we were going to put on that code, we could have used 16 letters, right? We could have used 10 letters.
And that would have made it nearly impossible, I think.
Yeah, we could have used 4, we could use 6 or whatever. But by increasing the number of letters that we put on there, we wouldn't necessarily make it any more fun.
Absolutely.
Right? The exercise was a little bit about the code, but mostly around sort of how you got around to doing it. Right? So adding that extra layer of complexity by making the code like super long or super hard to tell apart by using like lowercase L's and capital I's or ones, like that increases the complexity. And then if the commander gets the information and passes it on and they go, oh yeah, it was capital I, nope, sorry, it was lowercase L. Like that's not fun, right? That's just frustrating.
And it's sort of that, to pull from other things that are sort of similar, right? When you're designing games in Airsoft and game modes in Airsoft, you want the rules to be easily communicable, right? There's that sort of the KISS rule, the keep it simple, stupid, largely because you're going to be playing, in a lot of cases, telephone with these rules anyway. You're going to be telling 10 people and they're going to be telling 10 people. And it's good for everyone to be on the same page. Right, I can't count the number of games we've played where someone on my team or me has gone, how many respawns do we actually have?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they were there for the briefing, they were just, like staring off into space. And it happens to everyone. So it's good for that to be simple and easy to communicate. But if you're running like a larger game like the one we've sort of been talking about for the last bit, one of the things I would suggest you keep in mind is sort of the DMing rule of D&D, where if you create a complicated puzzle and are like, oh, the players are going to solve this pretty easily, they won't.
Yeah.
If you create a moderately hard puzzle, or even a kind of simple puzzle, often the players will be like, yeah, we're going to spend an hour doing this. And so you probably don't want to overcomplicate your larger, longer Airsoft game as much as you would think you would. Especially when you and your players aren't practiced at dealing with that. Because we've all watched huge milsim games on YouTube, or at least I assume you all spend your free time the way I do. And, you can have like a 1,000-person game with a ton of moving parts. But almost all of those games rely on a huge staff who've done this before, and a large number of players who are sort of functionally acting as officers who've also done it before. So plan accordingly, right? The bigger games I've run, I have gone and found friends of mine who are willing to go stand around in goggles and do weird stuff for a couple hours in exchange for beer and pizza after the game.
Yeah. And, in thinking about this kinds of stuff that hasn't really worked for us in the past, I think one game that I ran in particular, what I wanted to do was create this sort of objective where we had a briefcase, and the briefcase was going to be part of an objective. However, it was an EMP device, right? A fake EMP device, obviously, that the team was not aware of. So basically, the lore in the game was the other team has airdropped this piece of equipment. You need to go and steal it. So I told the commander, as part of their mission, you need to go to this grid reference. You need to retrieve this package that looks like this. And you need your team to bring it back to you. They must not open the package under any circumstance. And so the team went. And my plan was that if they opened the package, inside, they would find an envelope that says open immediately. And they would read from the envelope saying, this device was a fake EMP. Your radios don't work. Please turn them off. And you are not allowed to turn them back on until you return to your command center. With the idea that you got hit by an EMP and then the commander is going to ask for a sit rep and there's going to be no answer over the radios and it's going to create a whole kerfuffle. Well, the problem was that nobody listened to any of the instructions. So the commander sent the team. They went, they found the package, they opened the package, they saw the envelope, didn't read what it said on it, closed the package, brought it back to the commander, right? And then the commander's instructions inside the packet were like some stuff like you need to ask your team, did they open the briefcase? And if they say yes, then, they're going to lose points or whatever. But then nobody read any of that stuff. So the commander got the package back. He gave it to me, or he sort of called in on the radio and said, hey, so we've got the package back. And I said, okay, did your team open it? And he said, well, I don't know. Were they supposed to?
I didn't ask them. I just sent them back to doing other stuff.
So I had created this whole complicated scenario. But the reality is that at the time, nobody was really paying that much attention. It had to be way more simple than I was making it out to be. The scenario worked great on paper. It would have been so cool. Right? It would have been so cool. But the reality is that, like the saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. That's exactly what the situation was, right? They heard the instructions, but they didn't listen. And it's not a factor of them not paying attention or them being goobers or whatever. It's a question of there's a lot of stuff going on the field right now, right? You got a lot of stuff that you got to balance. And the fact that you even go to this grid and retrieve the package is basically as much as you can really pay attention to, right?
And it turns out that maybe part of the reason James Bond always opens the briefcase and reads the note inside is that that's in the script.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And the players opened it and they, there was an envelope that on both sides of it said, if you open this briefcase, open me now. Right? But they're not looking at it. There's there's a piece of paper in here. Close that back up. Off we go. Right? You're not thinking that way. And that's okay. Right? That's not a slight against those players. If they're listening to this, they may recognize themselves, in which case don't take this the wrong way. I actually think it's kind of funny. You're, like I was saying, you're under a lot of stress. You got a lot of stuff going on. Right? And so consequently, you don't notice that kind of stuff. And it's too bad because you can spend a lot of time coming up with these really great theoretical ideas for stuff that's going to happen in the game. And then as soon as it starts, you're actually, it's not working out at all the way that we intended, right? And we've seen that for all kinds of missions and stuff that we've done in the past.
One of the reasons I'm saying, you need to have stuff to cause people to go and get in conflict with one another is that we've run games without them and gone, that was a very quiet day of Airsoft.
Yeah, I mean, we've played some random milsims that we actually had random objectives drawn up in different envelopes. We had 10 different envelopes with random objectives, all different. And each team chose 3. So there were 4 left over.
And we didn't necessarily know what the objectives were.
We just had a whole pile of different objectives. So we didn't know the ones that were left behind. We didn't know the ones that the other team had, and we just knew that what our 3 objectives were. And then the end of the day was going to be, well, whenever one team is done with their objectives, they are just going to call the cell phone of the commander or the other team and be like, hey, we're done. That's it. Game's over or whatever. Because we didn't want to be on radios together, obviously, which makes total sense. But both teams played that whole day without a single engagement. They just went along their business and did whatever they were going to do that day. And it was a really tense day. You were concerned about enemy contact all the time. You might have seen other players, but nobody shot at anybody for 3 hours.
Yeah, everyone was just concerned with being really sneaky. And that did create some positive stuff. There was a lot of tension, but without the firefight to relieve that tension, it ends up being a very complicated 3-hour game of tag in which people were carrying around airsoft guns and not using them.
Yeah. And that's not to say you have to be shooting all the time, but when you're thinking about running games and stuff, what you people are there to shoot BBs, right? That's why we play Airsoft. So if you're planning objectives, there's nothing wrong with having like recon and long patrols and all this kind of stuff. But at some point, you want to make sure that there is a conflict, right? That teams do actually engage with each other in a way that is meaningful to the overall objective.
Yeah, absolutely. Having those players in that game doing, recon and stuff was great. We just needed to make sure that all of the objectives that we were creating had reasons to come into conflict with people doing the other objectives, so that we didn't end up, as it happened, with people drawing, 3 objectives each and going, all right, well, I don't need to go near where the enemy team is because none of my objectives say so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And again, that was being played like in what I think of as quite a large field, right? That was,
Yes. When we're playing at Redcliffe a lot more frequently, for sure.
Yeah, like that was not being played on, your sort of small curated field. That was being played over several square kilometers of woods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another good example of those types of game modes that we've run in the past pretty successfully is the Operation Asgardian Chill that you ran and the like subsequent operations that we ran that were similar. And what we did in those situations was like a large play area with a large defending team defending multiple different objectives, right? Like 4 or 5 different objectives. And then one smaller team, a highly mobile, like a special operations force or whatever. And their job was to go and like perform certain objectives and destroy certain like control points, such that as the day progresses, the defenders are defending fewer places and therefore the defensive concentration gets higher, right?
Yep. And that creates a really cool game mode where the players on the attacking team have it fairly easy for the beginning of the day, and it gets increasingly hard on them at the same time as they get more and more tired, which makes it quite difficult for the attackers. But it's also hard on the defenders because, I mean, it's pretty much the only game type we have. It's pretty much the only game type we've run where we have players who are sort of dealing with like being, I hesitate to say bored, but I'll stick with it because they're on sort of guard detail, right?
Yeah.
And keeping alert and keeping your sort of team together and working in that situation is definitely a challenge for that commander, which is cool. It's a very different experience. And, the defending commander has, a lot of options in terms of like, oh, well, will I get a group of guys together and send them out to patrol around? What do I want to do? How do I want to deal with the fact that I know there's a team coming? But one of the things we've definitely done that worked really well is sort of set the attacking team on a you must start within this timer, but not at the exact same time as the rest of the game.
Yeah, for sure. So the whistle, I think when I ran that game mode-ish last, we had the attackers start at firstly at a different place, different parking lot, so that the defenders didn't know exactly how many attackers there were. And they were on site starting at, I think, 9 o'clock. And the other team had, the defenders, were on site at 9 o'clock. And they had to be in position for their whistle to blow at like 9:30 or something. And then the attackers were on site starting at 9 as well, but they could go basically anytime they wanted after 9:30, right? So the defenders aren't sure really where the attackers were or when they would come and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, the defenders end up being very light on information unless they go out and look for it, which is, again, a choice their commander can make, and which, they're encouraged to do.
Yeah. And, a lot of that comes down to, well, you need to let the commanders come up with their own game plan, right?
Absolutely.
But on the flip side, you also need to make sure that they understand what they can do, because most people, again, don't necessarily have any command experience nor military experience. So they might not think that, hey, maybe I should create a patrol.
Or,
right?
Frankly, maybe I should, like if in the play area we were talking about, right? Like they didn't know where the enemy team was going to be or what time they started, but they did know that there was a second parking lot and that they weren't parking in it. And so there's a decent value there of like, okay, you two guys are pretty quick. Scoot over and just make an OP, right? Get an observation post looking at the other parking lot so we have information.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever actually seen anyone do that.
Nope. And then I think what we did as well in later iterations of that is as the attackers destroyed control points, they got certain benefits, right? So one control point would have been like a quote unquote SAM site. Well, if you destroy the SAM site, then you can get a drone, right? And then you can call the drone to give you a recon sweep of a particular like grid, right? And by recon sweep and drone, we mean a ref goes there and stands there in the grid and tells you how many players they can see from their position,
Yep.
right? Or one of the locations was a radio tower. If you destroy that by capturing it, then the other team can't use their radios for 30 minutes, aside from like legit medical emergencies or something like of that nature.
Yep.
So they have to basically turn their radios off for 30 minutes, which again, as an attacker, gives you an advantage. So you need to think about how you're going to time the different things that you do. But as well, like there's a break-even point. There's a point where you add on so much more complexity that it's just not. You can't factor it in. You can't factor for it when you're playing, and it's not adding any real gameplay value, right? It's not making it more fun. It's just making things harder.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And a good example of that actually is we've had the same sort of game mode and use the bonus for destroying the surface air missile site being like changing your pickup site for the team when they're exfiltrating to like somewhere closer and or more convenient, or like decreasing the time it takes for the rescue chopper to get there or whatever we make up to justify
Yeah.
it. And that's not a very good objective because it ends up just confusing both teams about where the enemies or where the small team's exfiltration point is, and it just makes things into a huge mess.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at how you run your games and the elements that you put in and stuff. And we've hopefully given you some things to think about in terms of game modes that, you might want to try. But I think some of the things that, we've found that really don't work very well, and we sort of talked about this a little bit, is this idea of adding complexity for complexity's sake. Making things more complex doesn't necessarily make them more fun. So you need to think about whether or not making something more complicated actually increases the fun and or just frustrates, right? And there is some value to making things more complicated, but you just need to make sure and my recommendation, and I think Pat can talk for himself, but my recommendation would definitely be to sort of start small and increase complexity slowly rather than just going full tilt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, really, I want to emphasize that, like, you will start this out and you'll go, oh my God, I have 300,000 ideas and I've listened to this podcast and I've read 80 pages of stuff online and I've watched 100 hours of Milsim games and I'm going to do everything. Don't. Mm-hmm. Right? The enthusiasm is awesome, and like it's enthusiasm that we have, and we can only tell you this because we've done it. Right? But if you present a bunch of players who've never played a Milsim game before with a scenario with like 30 moving parts that you're trying to juggle, A, you're not going to be able to juggle them all, and B, your players are going to be like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. The other thing to consider as well is that a lot of the things that you see in like video games and movies and stuff, they work because people don't die immediately when they're hit, right? Unless, in the movies, typically, if you're, Johnny Cool guy, you can get hit like a million times because you're not going to die because you're the plot device, right? And in video games, like you typically have a health bar and stuff like that, so one single hit is not going to end your play. But in Airsoft, that's not the case, right? You get hit, you're hit now. And unless you're playing with some specific game rule with like body armor or medics or something, that really creates a whole other level of problem. So even if you think of a game like Capture the Flag becomes immensely more difficult if the people trying to capture the flag can't actually get hit, right? Because as soon as you hit, you drop it. That flag's not going very far, because if I'm defending that flag, I have like 3 or 4 guns waiting to protect that particular area. Anybody gets close, they get shot. Anybody grabs it. Well, yeah, like so it adds a lot of challenges. So you will sometimes find that game modes that you think conceptually will work really well don't actually end up working that well because of the fact that if you get hit, you're hit, and that's it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you end up having this situation where you need to think about that. You need to think about the fact that, unlike in, almost every video game you'll have played, your players get tired.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so Having the last objective be at the top of the hill that they've already run up and down twice is a cruel thing to do, and that doesn't always mean you shouldn't do it. But like, be aware that you're being mean to those players, and make sure that you have players whose sort of reaction to that will be, well, I may get pat, right? Rather than, oh, I'm just going to sit down here. Yeah, and so like when I ran Asgardian Chill, and when I've run sort of subsequent similar things, the attacking team was players that I knew were physically fit enough to deal with running around in the woods all day, and whose mindset and desires for gameplay were there. And I did make an effort to like brief the players who were interested in being on the defending team about the fact that they were going to be standing around, and about the fact that like they were going to be needing to patrol and stuff. And I did find players who were interested in that, who wanted that sort of like, oh yeah, sentry duty, and like you will have time to set up a defensive position and defend it, play.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's definitely there's a bunch of stuff there for people to find engaging and enjoyable that isn't necessarily part of their normal airsoft play.
Yeah, for sure.
The drawback being that, you know, it's a lot of things to juggle for the player running the game. And one thing definitely that I took away from that game was having more than one ref is really critical.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
and like
for
I had
sure.
volunteers who were helping out and doing like specific things during that game, but I needed just a couple of more people to run interference and respond to questions and stuff like that, because I had 40 players.
And I think that's a really good point you just raised. Like, there's going to be questions throughout the day, especially if your rule set is a little bit more complicated. Like if you're using a medic system, how does the medic system work, right?
Totally.
Even if it's really simple, people will have questions about it, right? You know, we used a medic system once when we were playing in the summer, where the medic had water bottles, and for you to get revived, you had to drink this small bottle of water, right? And so it's like, do I have to drink the whole thing? Like, do I just take a sip, or like, what do I have to do here, right? And just having people on hand to be able to address that, or just generic questions like, oh, where's my respawn again? I don't know. Like all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, especially if like objectives being completed for either team can like move respawns and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to keep track of, if you're using points, to keep track of points and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's a lot to be said for like organization in general, but when you think about like game modes in general, right? Like you want to make sure that everyone is very familiar with every moving piece, and if they're not, then you need to make sure that you have people on hand who can answer those questions. And that's true whether that's a 2-hour milsim or an 8-hour milsim, or even, you know, a 30-minute skirmish, right?
Absolutely.
The last thing that I just want to leave you with, I think, is anytime that we've run a game recently, probably in the last few years, we've always followed up the game with a survey to the players, an anonymous survey, to ask them what they thought, right? To ask them some very specific questions about what they thought about certain aspects of the game, and also get their feedback in general. And I believe that this is extremely valuable because it allows you to understand and make sure that what the players tell you was fun or not fun at the game is actually true, right? Because if it's anonymous, if to your face they're going to tell you, yeah, everything was great film, great game, etc. But if they're pissed off about stuff, they're not going to necessarily tell you to your face, right? But if you give them the opportunity to fill out a survey, they will tell you truthfully, or more truthfully, what they actually felt about the day's events. And we've gotten some really, really good feedback, some honest feedback about parts that people thought sucked. And that allows us to remove them, right, in future, so we don't do those again because people didn't find them fun. Nobody's feelings got hurt. I mean, you know, I really don't care if you think my idea sucked. If you think it sucked, I would rather you tell me so that we don't do it again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's exactly what we got, right?
I think it's also important to accept that feedback in sort of a neutral space where you're not really getting mad at anyone for saying like, oh, this was terrible. Because like you might have had an idea where you're like, oh, this is going to be so good. That doesn't mean the players actually loved it.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully, guys, you've enjoyed this. We've ended up being a little more, I think, on the talking about milsim game modes that we like than we intended, but that leaves us with space for another episode talking about less milsim ones.
Yeah, that's true.
I know when we were planning this episode out, we didn't quite mean for it to go this direction, but ultimately, I guess that means that you guys have gotten a really good sample of what we love. You know, some of our favorite stuff in a really genuine way. And we will try to dial back the milsim and talk about some less milsim game modes that we enjoy a lot, probably in our next episode.
Yeah. And I guess with that, we'll leave it at that. I hope you have a great week. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Cheers.